The freight engine screamed into Ghost Hollow, just as the sun bled orange across the Missouri, brakes its iron wheels grinding sparks against warped rails that had seen better decades. Steam billowed through the platform in thick, choking clouds, turning the dusk into a dim theater where shadows moved with the uncertain rhythm of strangers waiting for something they couldn't name. The air tasted of coal smoke and dust, and the heat radiating from the locomotive's belly made the September evening feel like high summer oppressive and unforgiving. Serafina Delphine stood at the edge of that stage, mud caked to her boot heels, and splattered up the hem of her traveling dress, a dark blue cotton that had seen cleaner days. Her fingers clutched a letter that had been read aloud not 20 minutes earlier by the station agent, a pinch-faced man named Dobbs, who'd taken visible pleasure in every syllable, his voice rising with theatrical emphasis on the words morally unfit and breach of character. The paper trembled in her grip, ink already smearing against her palm from the sweat of her fear. She was 26 years old. She had crossed an ocean from Le Havre to New York, then half a continent by rail and wagon, surviving storms and sickness and the slow erosion of hope that came from traveling toward a future that existed only in letters. And now this paper, this single sheet of expensive linen stock with its official seal, declared her unfit for marital purpose, voiding the contract that had promised her a home, a husband, and a place to practice the botanical medicine her father had taught her before consumption took him in a charity ward in St. Louis. The crowd on the platform milled and muttered their faces, half hidden in the steam. Most were locals, farmers, and shopkeepers who'd come to watch the evening freight, but a knot of men stood apart near the water tower, harder men with gun belts slung low, and eyes that measured trouble by the dollar. At their center was Tom Kitteridge, a ranch foreman in his early 40s, with a face like weathered saddle leather and a mouth that rarely smiled except in cruelty. He spat a stream of tobacco juice that landed near Serafina's boot, the splatter deliberate. "She ain't wanted here," Kitteridge announced to no one in particular, but loud enough that the murmuring died. "Contract's void. Property reverts to territorial management, which means it reverts to the railroad trust, which means—" His grin widened, showing teeth stained the color of old bone. "It's ours. Best she moves on before dark. Nothing good happens to women alone after dark in Ghost Hollow." The men flanking him, 3 of them, lean and sun-darkened hands, resting easy on the butts of their revolvers, nodded in agreement. One of them, a younger man with a scar splitting his left eyebrow, let his gaze slide over Serafina in a way that made her skin crawl. She had nowhere to move on to. The greenhouse at the edge of town, half flooded by 3 springs of high water, and held together with tar paper and stubbornness, was all she had left. Her father's keepsake, a small green-tinted vial etched with symbols she'd never fully understood, pressed cold against her ribs through the pocket of her canvas apron, was the only thing of value she still carried. Besides the clothes on her back and the leather satchel at her feet that held her notebooks, seed packets, and a few precious jars of dried herbs. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, to demand that someone explain how a contract signed and sealed in St. Louis could be voided by a man who worked for the very railroad that stood to profit from her dispossession. But the conductor's whistle shrieked a piercing scream that drowned her words before they could form. And the platform erupted into motion as passengers pushed forward to board, and freight handlers shouted orders over the hiss of steam. That was when the Lakota warrior stepped between her and the closing men. He was tall, over 6 feet, with shoulders broad, under a weathered buckskin shirt decorated with simple quill work in red and black geometric patterns. His dark hair was tied back with a strip of rawhide, and his face, angular and strong-boned, carried the calm intensity of someone who'd learned to read danger in the smallest shifts of wind and shadow. Late 20s, Serafina guessed, though, his eyes dark brown, almost black in the failing light, carried the weight of someone who'd seen more winters than that, who'd survived things that left marks deeper than scars. A bone-handled knife rode his belt in a beaded sheath, and his hands scarred across the knuckles and along the backs from a lifetime of hard use, hung loose at his sides, ready, not threatening, but undeniably present. He didn't look at Kitteridge or his men. He looked at Serafina, and in that moment of eye contact, something passed between them that she couldn't name. Not attraction, not yet, but recognition. The recognition of two people who'd been pushed to edges and refused to fall. "With me," he said. His voice was low, steady, the kind that cut through noise without raising volume. He placed one palm gently against her cheek, thumb resting just below her eye, and the shock of the touch, firm, grounding, utterly unexpected, steadied her breathing enough that she could see past the steam and fear. His hand was warm, calloused, and for reasons she couldn't articulate, it felt safer than anything had felt in months. Kitteridge's grin vanished like smoke. "Step aside, Red Hawk. This ain't your business." The warrior motto she would learn later, though most whites called him Red Hawk for the crimson-painted hawk feather he sometimes wore in his hair during ceremonies, didn't move. His other hand lowered to the knife hilt, not gripping it, just resting there in a statement of readiness. "It is now." The three armed men stepped forward in unison. Boots crunching gravel, the metallic whisper of gun leather shifting. One of them, the scarred one, reached for his revolver, a Navy Colt worn, smooth by use. The conductor, a red-faced man in a blue uniform, already dark with sweat, yelled something about clearing the line, about schedules and company rules, his voice cracking with impatience. The freight engine hissed louder, a serpent coiling to strike, and the platform shook under the weight of iron and steam and the tension of violence waiting to erupt. Kitteridge shoved past a farmer's wife, clutching a basket of eggs, closing the distance between himself and Serafina, with the confident stride of a man who'd never been told no, and didn't intend to start hearing it now. He swung a fist, not at Matto, but at Serafina, a mean backhand meant to send her sprawling onto the tracks where the engine's wheels could do the rest. It was the kind of violence that could be explained away as an accident, a stumble in the crowd, a tragedy no one could prevent. Matto moved faster than Serafina's eye could follow. His shoulder caught Kitteridge square in the chest, a solid impact that drove the foreman back 3 stumbling steps and sent his hat flying. A pistol butt cracked against Matto's ribs from the side. The scarred man had gotten close faster than expected, but Matto twisted with the impact, turning pain into momentum. He drove his elbow backward into the man's jaw, a sharp crack of bone on bone, and ripped the Navy Colt from the man's hand in a single fluid motion. He tossed it into the crowd metal, clattering against wood planks, and the crowd scattered like startled birds. "Move," he told Serafina, his voice still calm, still controlled, hauling her by the wrist toward the shadows cast by the freight office. His grip was iron tight, but not painful, and she found herself running before her mind caught up with her body, clutching her satchel against her chest with her free hand. The train lurched forward, couplings clanking like chains being dragged across stone, and the platform erupted into shouting. A shot rang out, wild, high-fired, more in anger than aim, and a lamp post shattered raining glass that glittered like ice in the fading light. They ran. Matto's grip on her wrist never faltered, his breathing controlled even as hers came ragged and desperate. He pulled her around the corner of the freight office, down a narrow alley, choked with shipping crates, stenciled with St. Louis addresses, and rusted barrel hoops that had been discarded and forgotten. The smell of grease and old grain hung thick here, mingling with the sharper scent of tar and creosote. Finally, he hauled her into the dark mouth of a loading bay, a space barely wide enough for 2 people, where the shadows were deep enough to hide them if they stayed still. He pressed her against the wall, one hand flat beside her head, his body angled to shield her from the entrance. His ribs heaved once pain from the pistol butt. She realized, seeing the way he held his left side, but he didn't make a sound. Footsteps pounded past the alley, mouth-heavy boots on wooden planks. Kitteridge's voice cursing in a steady stream of profanity that would have made Seraphina's mother faint. The metallic click of a hammer being cocked, sharp and unmistakable. Maddo didn't speak. He watched the alley with the stillness of a hunter waiting for game to pass. And Seraphina watched him, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might crack a rib. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, could see the tiny scar that cut through his left eyebrow, could smell the scent of wood smoke and sage that clung to his clothes. The green vial in her apron pocket dug into her side, a small, sharp pressure that reminded her of everything she still had to lose. When the footsteps faded and the shouting moved farther away toward the rail yards, Maddo finally looked at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable, but there was something in them, an assessment, a calculation, and beneath that, something almost like concern. "You hurt." She shook her head, not trusting her voice, then forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "No. Thank you." He released her wrist, stepping back half a pace to give her room to breathe. "Don't thank me yet." He glanced toward the alley mouth, then back at her, his gaze dropping to the crumpled letter still in her hand. "What's in that letter?" Seraphina swallowed hard, tasting dust and fear. "A lie." The word came out harsher than she intended, edged with bitterness. A lie dressed up as law. Maddo's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, a readiness, a coiling of tension like a blade being drawn. "Then we'd better find the truth." The greenhouse stood at the southern edge of Ghost Hollow, where the Ghost River misnamed because there was nothing ghostly about the slow, sullen current that carried silt and debris from the breaks, had flooded 3 springs running, and left the land half drowned, half dead. It was a skeleton of wood and glass, patched with tar paper and oilcloth, where panes had shattered, surrounded by rows of wilting prairie plants that Seraphina had coaxed from seed with more hope than expertise. Inside, the air smelled of earth and smoke and something green and stubborn that refused to die. Long tables constructed from salvaged planks held clay pots, and drying racks hung from the rafters bundles of herbs, swaying gently in the breeze that slipped through the broken panes, sage, yarrow, wild bergamot, echinacea. Seraphina pushed open the crooked door, and Maddo followed her inside his presence, filling the small space in a way that should have been uncomfortable, but somehow wasn't. A lantern hung from a nail, and she lit it with shaking hands, casting weak yellow light across the chaos. Half her stock had been knocked over. Someone had been here earlier, rifling through her things. Soil spilled across the floor. A rack of drying mint lay crushed under a boot print. She set the crumpled letter on the nearest table and pressed her palms flat against the wood, forcing herself to take slow, steady breaths. "They want the land," she said quietly. "The water rights that come with it. Tom Kitteridge works for a man named Silas Deke, railroad money, silver speculation, the kind of man who buys sheriffs and judges when he needs them. My mail-order contract was supposed to tie me to this plot, give me enough legal standing to hold it against claim jumpers. But Kitteridge found a way to void it. Called me unfit." Maddo moved to the window, scanning the night beyond. His movements were economical, nothing wasted. "What did you do to earn that?" "I made medicine." She gestured at the racks, the jars of salve lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. "Prairie cures the kind the elders taught me when I first came here 2 years ago. Treated fevers, aches, wounds, sold them cheap, sometimes gave them away to folks who couldn't afford Dr. Hart's fees. The town council called it heathen work, passed an ordinance banning the sale of any medicine not approved by a licensed physician. I refused to stop." Maddo glanced back at her, his eyes narrowing. "And Kitteridge." Seraphina's hands curled into fists. The memory rose unbidden, the storage shed behind the depot, the smell of machine oil and dust, Kitteridge's hands on her shoulders, his breath reeking of whiskey. She'd fought. scratched his face, driven her knee up hard enough to make him gasp and run. He made an offer once. She said, her voice flat. In a storage shed behind the depot. Last spring when I came to pick up a seed shipment, I said no. He didn't like that. Silence filled the space between them, heavy and cold as winter stone. Maddo turned fully, his expression unreadable, but his voice carrying an edge she hadn't heard before. He touched you. Tried. She met his gaze, lifting her chin. I fought. Got away. Dr. Hart saw the bruises after, but we both kept quiet. Fear's a strong gag. Maddo's jaw worked, muscles shifting under skin, but he didn't press further. Instead, he reached into the leather pouch at his belt and drew out a curved buffalo horn powder flask, old, and worn, its surface polished smooth by decades of handling. It was etched with marks that caught the lantern light symbols of ferns and bluffs, tiny crosses and tick marks that marched along its length like a map without borders. He set it on the table beside her letter, with a care that bordered on reverence. My father carved this before he died, he said. 15 winters ago, during a hunt that went wrong. He was tracking elk through the breaks when a rock slide took him. He followed game paths from the Missouri breaks south to the prairie places where water runs deep under the earth. He traded notes with a French surveyor once, years back. The marks here, they're not decoration, they're directions, water sources, hidden seeps and springs that don't show on white men's maps. My band needs those roots. Drought's been hard the last 3 years. Wells are failing. Serafina stared at the flask, her breath catching. Slowly, carefully, she reached into her apron pocket and drew out the green vial. It was no bigger than her thumb, hand-blown glass, with tiny bubbles trapped in the curve, etched with symbols that mirrored the ones on the horn-stylized plants, hatched lines representing terrain numbers that might have been distances or elevations or both. She held it up to the lantern light. My father left me this, she said. He was a surveyor. Etienne Delphine. Came through here in the 50s, mapped the basin for a railroad that never got built. He died before he could explain what this vial meant. I thought it was just a keepsake. Maddo took the vial carefully, his fingers brushing hers in a contact that sent an unexpected jolt through her. He turned it in the lantern light, comparing it to the flask. And Serafina watched his face transform as he saw what she was seeing, and the symbols aligning, dovetailing like pieces of a puzzle that had waited 30 years to be solved. It's a cipher, Maddo said, his voice tight with realization. Written in plants and stone. Your father marked where moisture-loving species grow thick, the kind that only thrive where underground water runs close to the surface. Mine marked the paths between them, the game trails and river bends. Together, it's a map, Serafina finished. A map to water. Footsteps crunched on gravel outside, sharp and deliberate. Maddo moved to the door, and a heartbeat, knife in hand, body coiled. A soft knock followed 3 taps, deliberate. A man's voice, older, careful. Miss Delphine, it's Elias Hart. I've got my bag. May I come in? Serafina hurried to unlatch the door. The sturdy Hart stepped inside, a wiry man in his 50s with silver threading his beard and deep lines carved around his eyes. His leather medical bag was worn smooth by years of use. He glanced at Maddo, then at the knife still in Maddo's hand, and nodded once. Heard there was trouble at the station. Figured someone might need stitching. Maddo sheathed the blade. Ribs, not deep. Hart set his bag on the table and pulled out thread and a needle. Sit. You bleed on her floor, it'll stain. Maddo sat on the edge of the table, shrugging out of his buckskin shirt with a wince he tried to hide. The gash below his ribs was shallow, but ugly, already crusting with dried blood. Serafina moved to his side without thinking, her hand steadying his arm as Hart threaded the needle. The doctor's fingers were quick and precise. Matto's breathing stayed shallow and controlled, but his eyes tracked Serafina's hands the way they didn't shake, even when Hart's needle pulled tight. "Thank you," Matto said when it was done. Hart packed his bag with fussy precision. "Thank me by staying alive. Both of you." He glanced at Serafina, and she saw genuine worry in his eyes. "Kitteridge won't let this stand. Deke's got too much riding on that land. The silver operation needs water to power the stamping mills. You two are standing in the way of a lot of money." "We know," Serafina said. Hart's eyes crinkled at the corner's approval, or maybe pity, but he said nothing as he left, slipping back into the dark. Serafina turned to Matto, who was pulling his shirt back on with careful movements. "Why are you helping me?" He glanced at the flask and vial lying side by side on the table. "Because our fathers wanted this map to be used. Not hidden, not lost, used." He paused, his gaze finding hers. "And because you're not afraid to fight for what's yours, even when the whole town tells you to quit." "I'm terrified," she admitted. "Good," Matto said, standing and testing his weight. He winced, but didn't falter. "Fear keeps you sharp. Just don't let it stop you from moving." They needed the county survey ledgers to decode the map properly, to match the symbols to specific landmarks and prove where the water ran. The ledgers were kept in the sheriff's office, locked in a safe and guarded by Deputy Samuel Banner, a man Serafina had seen around town but never spoken to. Banner was in his late 30s, quiet with the kind of face that gave nothing away. He walked with a limp, an old injury, people said, from his time as a cavalry scout, before he took the deputy's badge. What Serafina didn't know, what almost no one in Ghost Hollow knew, was that Banner carried a secret so dark it had hollowed him out from the inside. 7 years ago, during a raid on a Cheyenne camp, Banner had fired the shot that killed a 12-year-old boy. The boy had been unarmed, running for cover, and Banner had mistaken him for an armed warrior in the chaos of smoke and screaming. The realization had come too late, the body already cooling in the grass. Banner had carried that weight every day since. Silas Deke had discovered the truth 3 years ago through a former Army officer who'd witnessed the shooting. Deke had bought the officer's silence and acquired the written testimony, and he'd been using it to control Banner ever since. One word to the Cheyenne bands, still camped near the territory, one piece of paper delivered to the right person, and Banner would be a dead man within a week. So Banner did what Deke ordered, hating himself a little more each day, trapped in a hell of his own making. The storm rolled in just after midnight, exactly as Matto had predicted. Thunder cracked like artillery over the plains, splitting the sky with sound that rattled windows. Lightning flickered on the western horizon. Rain never fell, the clouds always promising and never delivering, but the noise was enough. Matto and Serafina moved through the flooded streets like shadows sticking to the raised plank walkways. 3 years of high water had transformed Ghost Hollow into a strange, half-drowned town, where Main Street ran ankle-deep 6 months of the year. Water lapped at the posts beneath their feet, dark and restless. The sheriff's office sat at the end of Main Street, a squat building of rough-hewn logs with barred windows. A single oil lamp burned inside, casting a weak glow across the wooden porch, where Deputy Banner slouched in a chair, his hat pulled low, a wool coat draped over his shoulders. He appeared to be sleeping, his breath whistling through the storm's noise. Matto crouched behind a stack of rain barrels, and Serafina pressed close beside him. He pointed to the window on the side of the building, a section where the frame had warped, leaving a gap. She nodded, pulling a set of slender tweezers from her apron pocket. Her hands trembled. Matto covered them briefly with his own warmth and steadiness, then released her and gestured forward. They moved in silence, boots careful on the slick boards. At the window, Serafina slipped the tweezers through the gap, fishing blindly for the peg, where Dr. Hart had said the safe keys hung. Her fingers trembled. The tweezers scraped wood, then clinked against metal soft, almost inaudible. She drew them back with excruciating slowness, a ring of keys dangling from the tweezer's grip. Maddow exhaled, barely audible. Banner stirred. His head-lifted eyes bleary, and he stared toward the interior of the office. Maddow grabbed a pebble from the walkway and flicked it. It pinged off the pot-bellied stove's iron door. Banner grunted, heaved himself upright, and shuffled over to check the fire. Maddow and Serafina slipped through the side door, easing it shut behind them with a care that made her shoulders ache from tension. The office smelled of tobacco and old leather and sweat and fear. The safe sat in the corner, a black iron box with a brass lock. Serafina's hands shook as she tried the keys one by one. The first jammed. The second wouldn't turn. The third clicked home, and the door swung open with a soft groan. Inside stacks of papers, a pistol, a bottle of whiskey. And at the bottom, beneath everything else, a leather-bound ledger stamped with a territorial seal and dated 1852. Serafina pulled it free, while Maddow grabbed a folded map from the same Shelf County boundaries, elevation lines, river routes. Thunder boomed close enough to rattle the walls. Banner's boots thumped on the floor, heading back toward his chair. But then they stopped, changed direction, headed toward the back room where the safe was. Serafina's blood turned to ice. Maddow grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward the narrow closet where cleaning supplies were stored, the only hiding place available. They pressed inside barely enough room for two people, the door not quite closing all the way. Through the crack, they could see Banner enter the back room, lamp held high. He walked directly to the safe, stared at it. The door was closed, but Serafina's heart sank as she realized she hadn't locked it properly. The tumblers hadn't fully engaged. Banner would see, he'd know. He reached for the safe door, and Serafina held her breath, pressing back against Maddow in the cramped darkness. She could feel his heart hammering against her shoulder blade, could hear his carefully controlled breathing in her ear. Banner's fingers touched the safe handle. Then he stopped. His hand fell away. He stood there for a long moment, staring at nothing, his face illuminated by lamplight, showing an expression of such profound weariness that Serafina almost felt sorry for him. Then he turned and walked back to the front office, without checking the safe. They waited in the closet for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When Banner's snores resumed, they slipped out through the back door into the alley. The skiff was where they'd left it, and they climbed in, Serafina clutching the ledger to her chest, while Maddow paddled them downstream toward the cottonwood grove. He knew. Serafina whispered when they were safely away. He knew someone had been there. He chose not to look. "Or he's waiting," Maddow said, "setting a trap." But Serafina didn't think so. She'd seen Banner's face in that lamplight, seen the exhaustion and something that looked almost like relief. Whatever Banner was, whatever he'd done for Deke, some part of him was tired of carrying the weight. By dawn, they deciphered enough of the map to understand the scope of what Deke was planning. The aquifer ran east through the Blue Stem Prairie, down through Cottonwood Bends, and ended at limestone breaks directly under Deke's new silver shaft. If he dammed the Ghost River to power his stamping mills, he'd cut off the natural flow. The seeps would dry up within a year. He'd control the only reliable water for 50 miles. "We need to mark the route," Maddow said, spreading the county map across a flat rock. "Plant physical stakes at 3 key points. If we can show the town council where the water flows naturally, they can block Deke's water rights claim." They spent the next 2 days doing exactly that, riding out to the prairie swale to the river ford, planting wooden stakes with red cloth tied to the tops. It was exhausting work in brutal heat, and they knew they were being watched. Matto spotted the rider on the second day, a distant figure on a bluff tracking their movements. Vale. Matto said, his voice tight. Mason Vale, Deke's best rifleman. The shot came at noon on the third day when they were marking the final stake near the river ford. The rifle crack split the air, and Serafina's horse screamed and reared. Matto grabbed the reins, his own mount dancing sideways, and dragged both animals toward the river at a gallop. Another shot kicked up sand near his boot. Into the water, Matto shouted, driving his horse into the shallows. Serafina followed the shock of cold, stealing her breath. Bullets slapped the surface, and her horse panicked. Matto threw himself off his mount, dragging Serafina down with him behind a massive driftwood log. He covered her body with his one arm, holding the ledger above water, the other braced against the log. Can't stay here, she gasped. Vale's reloading, single-shot rifle. When he chambers the next round, we crawl. The rifle cracked again. Splinters exploded from the log. Matto's voice was steady in her ear. Hold steady. Focus on my voice. But Vale wasn't just taking shots and waiting. He was moving, repositioning, cutting off their escape routes. What followed was a brutal game of cat and mouse that lasted 3 hours. Every time they tried to move, Vale had a new angle. Every time they thought they'd found cover, another shot would force them to relocate. Matto's knowledge of the terrain was the only thing that kept them alive. He guided them through shallow channels where the water ran too fast for clear shooting behind rock formations that blocked Vale's sight lines, through stands of willow where the dense growth made targeting impossible. But Vale was patient, methodical, and he had time and ammunition on his side. By mid-afternoon, they'd made it to the far bank, but Matto's reopened rib wound was bleeding freely, and Serafina's hands were raw from crawling over rocks. Vale's silhouette appeared on the bluff one final time, then disappeared. He'd lost them, at least for now. They rode south, pushing the horses hard, knowing this was only the beginning. Deke would escalate. They'd proven the aquifer route existed, marked it with stakes that anyone could follow. Now they needed to present the evidence before Deke could destroy it. Mrs. Lark Bennett, the schoolteacher, provided the final piece of intelligence they needed. She found them at the greenhouse at dawn, her face set in grim determination. Kitteridge keeps detailed records at the depot, she said without preamble. Shipment logs, contracts, correspondence with Deke. If the conspiracy is documented, and men like Deke always document everything for legal protection, it'll be in his office safe. When? Matto asked. During the morning freight run. Every available hand goes to the platform to load and unload. The depot office is empty from 6 to 6:30. 10 minutes, maybe 15 if the shipment's large. They broke into the depot office the next morning, moving fast through the cramped room stacked with shipping crates. Serafina rifled through Kitteridge's desk with hands that wanted to shake but couldn't afford to. Behind a loose panel, she found the safe. 3 tries feeling for the pins to align. The tumblers clicked on the 4th attempt. Inside bundles of cash, a pistol, and beneath those, a sheaf of papers tied with legal ribbon. The contract laid it out in merciless detail. All water rights south of Ghost Hollow, transferred to the Deke Mining and Railroad Consortium in exchange for a 15% share of silver profits, plus $5,000 split between Crowley and Kitteridge, contingent on the removal of Serafina Delphine from her property. But there was more. A copy of the letter that had been read at the station, bearing a note in Kitteridge's handwriting, drafted per agreement with SD. Judge's blank seal, applied spring 1854. Letter to be delivered publicly for maximum effect. The letter was a forgery. The rejection, the claim of moral unfitness, it was all manufactured. Beneath the contract lay a surveyor's report detailing the underground aquifer route, concluding that Deke's diversion would capture approximately 80% of regional groundwater flow within 2 years, rendering existing wells and natural seeps non-viable. Deke knew. He'd known from the beginning that damming the river would destroy the aquifer, and he'd done it anyway. Serafina. Matto's voice was sharp. Time. Workers are finishing up. She stuffed the papers into her satchel and followed him out, slipping into the alley just as the morning freight pulled away. Deke moved to crush them with calculated precision. By noon, Dr. Hart had been arrested on a trumped-up charge of morphine diversion. Mrs. Bennett received a notice that her schoolhouse lease was under review. The message was clear: help the troublemakers, and you'll lose everything. Jonah Pike, a gaunt farmer with 3 children, appeared at the greenhouse before sunset. They're putting together a posse, he said, voice low. Banner's leading it. They want Matto taken in for assault, attempted murder. And you too, Miss Delphine. Arson. Banner gave me a choice: ride with the posse or lose my job. I got 3 kids. You do what you have to, Matto said. Jonah's eyes glistened. There's a dust storm rolling in from the west. Big one. It'll hit around dusk. If you're smart, you'll use it to run. We're not running, Serafina said. The storm hit at dusk, a rolling wall of bronze dust that blotted out the sun. Wind screamed through the broken greenhouse panes. Visibility dropped to nothing but swirling dust that filled nose and mouth and eyes. Then the torches came. Through the dust, orange flames bobbed and weaved, riders carrying fire and violence. A torch sailed through the air, crashing through a broken pane into the remaining dry racks. Flames roared up instantly. Heat slammed into Serafina like a physical force. Out. Matto grabbed her arm, but she twisted free, diving back toward the table where the photograph of her mother lay in its tarnished frame, the only image she had left. She grabbed it just as the table caught fire, heat searing her hand. Matto hauled her bodily out the door and into the storm. He pulled her down behind a half-buried wagon wheel, his body shielding hers. Stay low. A rider loomed out of the dust, torch raised. Matto surged up to meet him, caught the man's wrist, twisted hard. The rider fell from his saddle with a scream the wind swallowed. Matto stamped the torch into the dirt, then pulled Serafina forward as another rider charged from a different direction. Jonah Pike rode past them without stopping, swinging wide to avoid trampling them, pretending not to see. Another rider drove straight for Serafina, lariat swinging. Matto shoved her aside and took the impact himself, and the rope catching him across the chest. He hit the ground hard. Deputy Banner dismounted 10 feet away, pistol drawn. You're done. Red Hawk, end of the line. Matto stood slowly, empty-handed. We have proof of Deke's fraud. Contracts, ledgers, everything. Let us present it to the town council tomorrow. A fair hearing. That's all we're asking. You'll present it to a noose, Banner said, but his voice cracked. His hand trembled. Deke's orders. In the swirling dust and chaos, no one else could see Banner's face clearly. But Serafina could, and what she saw was a man being torn apart from the inside. His finger on the trigger shook visibly. A gunshot cracked, not Banner's. Mason Vale, appearing from the dust, fired his rifle into the air. Hold-up storm's getting worse. Someone's going to get killed by accident, then we'll have federal marshals crawling all over Ghost Hollow. Fall back to town. Banner hesitated, his pistol still trained on Matto. Finally, he lowered the weapon. This ain't over. At dawn, we're coming with a legal writ. Enjoy your last night. The riders retreated. Matto and Serafina waited until the hoofbeats faded, then stumbled toward the cottonwood grove. They found shelter in a dry wash, pressing into the lee of the bank, while the wind howled overhead. Serafina cradled her burned hand. The photograph was ash. Everything she'd built reduced to smoke and memory. Tears carved tracks through the dust on her face. Maddo wrapped her hand with a strip torn from his shirt. "You saved the contracts," he said quietly. "That's what matters." "I wanted the photograph," she whispered. "I know." He finished the wrap. "Memory is harder to lose than you think. The image might be gone, but she's still here." He tapped her chest above her heart. "Where it counts." Serafina leaned into him. "Promise me something." "What?" "Promise you'll keep breathing. Keep fighting. I'm not doing this alone. I can't." Maddo's arm came around her shoulders. "If you keep going, I'll keep going. We're partners now. That means something." The storm broke before midnight. They moved through the dark toward the limestone gorge where Deke's men were preparing to blast the diversion tunnel. Intelligence from Mrs. Bennett Dynamite had been hauled to the gorge site hidden under tarps. Banner and a crew were set to light fuses at dawn, timing the blast to coincide with Judge Morrison's arrival on the morning train. Jonah Pike met them at the gorge rim, his face haunted. "I can't watch you hang, and I can't watch my kids die of thirst. So I'm here." Maddo clasped his shoulder. "Then let's make it count." They descended into the gorge boots, sliding on loose shale. The ghost river ran low and sluggish below. Ahead, lamplight flickered near the tunnel entrance. Voices murmured, men working late standing guard. Maddo signaled flank left, stay low, move, silent. They moved like shadows. 2 guards stood watch at the tunnel mouth, smoking and talking in low voices. Maddo and Jonah closed from opposite sides. No words, no warning. They took the guards down quickly, quietly binding them with their own belts. A gunshot split the night. Mason Vale stepped from behind a rock outcrop pistol, raised his broken wrist, bound tight. "Figured you'd come. Deke promised me $200. The bullet had clipped Jonah's shoulder, a graze that tore cloth and skin. Jonah gasped, stumbling. Serafina ran forward, dropping to her knees beside Jonah, ignoring Vale's pistol. She jammed a cloth from her satchel into the wound, pressing hard. "Hold steady," she whispered fiercely. "You have 3 children. You're not dying tonight." Maddo threw a handful of pebbles against the rock wall behind Vale. The clatter echoed. Vale twisted toward the sound. Maddo closed the distance before Vale could adjust, and they collided, grappling for the gun. Vale drove his knee into Maddo's injured ribs. Maddo grunted but didn't let go. The pistol fired wild. Maddo drove his elbow into Vale's broken wrist. Vale screamed, and the pistol fell. Maddo shoved him toward the gorge edge. Vale's boots skidded on loose shale. For a moment he teetered, then caught himself. "Go," Maddo said. "Tell Deke we're not leaving." Vale nodded and scrambled away. They scattered the dynamite charges, cutting fuses. Sweat dripped down Serafina's back. Her burned hand screamed with each movement, but she forced it to work. The rattle of a handcar echoed from the rail line above. Tom Kitteridge appeared at the gorge rim, rage twisting his face. He dropped a fresh crate of dynamite and lunged at Serafina, grabbing her arm. "Let's see how stubborn you are buried under 1,000 tons of rock." Maddo leapt from the flume wall, landing hard. His injured ribs protested with agony that stole his breath. Kitteridge heard him spun and swung a heavy wrench in a vicious arc. The tool connected with Maddo's ribs, the same ones that had been cut-stitched, reopened, and something gave way, with a crack that Serafina heard from 10 feet away. Maddo went down. This time he didn't get back up. Blood flecked his lips. One of the broken ribs had punctured his lung. He couldn't draw a full breath. Couldn't move without white-hot agony exploding through his chest. He tried to stand, tried to reach for his knife, but his legs wouldn't support him. He collapsed, gasping, drowning in his own blood. Kitteridge raised the wrench for a finishing blow aimed at Mattow's skull. Serafina didn't think. She threw herself at Kitteridge, sinking her teeth into his thumb and the same hand that had grabbed her in the storage shed that had destroyed her life. She bit down until she tasted blood. Kitteridge howled, releasing her. She kicked his knee with every ounce of strength she possessed. He staggered back, and Jonah, pale and swaying, rammed the handcar with his good shoulder, sending it careening into the fresh crate of fuses. Dynamite sticks scattered. Sparks flew. Deputy Banner charged down from the rail line, pistol drawn. Hoofbeats thundered above. Silas Deke rode up with Sheriff Crowley and a dozen armed men, torches painting the gorge in hellish light. "Put them down," Deke ordered Crowley. "All of them. No witnesses." Crowley drew his pistol, aiming at Mattow's prone form. The sheriff's face was pale sick. His finger tightened on the trigger. "I'm sorry." Banner stepped forward, placing himself between Crowley's gun and Mattow. "No." The silence that followed was absolute, except for the roar of water. "Step aside, Banner," Crowley said. "That's an order." "No." Banner's voice was steady now, certain. He looked at Deke, then at Crowley. "I've done things I'm ashamed of. Looked the other way. Followed orders I shouldn't have followed. But I'm not killing people to protect a silver mine." Deke's face remained stone, but his eyes flickered with something dangerous. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. "You want to be a hero, Banner. Let's tell everyone why you really took this job. Let's tell them about that Cheyenne boy, the 12-year-old you shot in the back 7 years ago during that raid. I have the testimony. I have the witness. You step aside now, or by tomorrow morning, every Cheyenne band within 100 miles knows your name and your face." Banner went white. His hand on his pistol trembled. Everyone could see it now, with the weight he'd been carrying, the secret that had been eating him alive. Serafina watched his face crumble, watched 7 years of guilt and shame surface all at once. "Do you know what they'll do to you?" Deke pressed his voice soft and cruel. "They'll flay you alive, Banner. They'll make it last days. And they'll be right to do it, because you murdered a child." Banner's pistol started to lower. His shoulders sagged. Defeat washed over his features. But then his gaze fell on Mattow, barely conscious, blood pooling beneath him. On Serafina, burned and exhausted and still fighting. On Jonah Pike, wounded and standing anyway. On the townspeople Mrs. Bennett had brought half of Ghost Hollow, standing silent witness with torches and rifles. Banner straightened, his hand steadied on his pistol. "Then they'll do it," he said quietly. "If that's my fate, I'll meet it. But not before I do one thing right. Not before I choose the kind of man I want to die as." He turned his pistol on Deke. "You'll hang for this," Deke hissed. "Maybe." Banner's jaw set. "But at least I'll die knowing I tried to do the right thing at the end. And that's more than you'll ever have." Deke's face twisted with rage. In a movement faster than anyone expected, he pulled a small Derringer from his vest, a gambler's hideaway gun, and grabbed Serafina, yanking her against his chest with the gun pressed to her ribs. "This ends now. Drop the papers or I'll put a hole through her lung." He dragged her toward the trestle where the night freight was due. Serafina could hear the distant whistle, could feel the faint vibration in the rails. Mattow tried to stand to follow, but his body wouldn't obey. He collapsed again, coughing blood. Banner stepped forward, hands raised. "Trade." The map, both pieces for her. "The flask," Deke demanded. "Put it on the ground, and the vial." Banner looked at Mattow, who nodded weakly. Banner picked up the buffalo horn flask and the green vial, held them up, then set them carefully on the ground, halfway between them and Deke. "Let her go first," Banner said. "No," Serafina said. The firmness in her voice surprised even her. She'd spent 2 years being afraid, being pushed, being told she wasn't good enough. She was done. She drove her knee up and back into Deke's groin with vicious force, wrenched his gun hand away from her ribs, and threw herself off the trestle into the channel 10 feet below. The water was shallow, waist-deep, cold enough to steal breath. Deke cursed, firing wildly. Banner dove after Serafina, covering her body with his as the shot whined past. The freight thundered toward them, its whistle screaming, the whole world shaking with its approach. In the churn below, Deke's boot caught between rocks wedged tight. He fired his second shot at Banner, grazing the deputy's shoulder. Banner grappled him in the waist-deep water. Serafina spotted the makeshift dam, upstream logs, and sandbags holding back the river's full force. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "Water is stronger than stone, ma chérie. It just needs the right path." She grabbed the pry bar an engineer had left on the bank and slammed it into the gate plank. Once. Splinters flew. Twice. The wood cracked. Her burned hand split open, blood mixing with river water. She screamed with the pain, but didn't stop. The gate gave way. Water exploded through in a roaring wall 8 feet high, carrying debris and mud and the accumulated weight of a river held back too long. But Deke wasn't going down without one final fight. As the water hit, he broke free from Banner, lunged at Serafina with murder in his eyes. What followed happened on the railroad trestle as the freight bore down on them, whistle, shrieking brakes, screaming. Deke caught Serafina by the throat, slammed her against a support beam. Water surged below them, timber groaning under the strain. The whole structure shook. "You cost me everything." Deke snarled, his face inches from hers. "You and that savage. I'll kill you both before I let you win." Serafina couldn't breathe. Her vision started to gray at the edges. Deke's hands were iron, crushing her windpipe. The freight was 50 yards away. 40. The engineer was screaming, trying to brake, but momentum and gravity didn't care. She thought of her father teaching her the names of plants, his patient voice explaining that the smallest flower could break through rock if it was stubborn enough. She thought of Maddo bleeding in the dirt, trusting her to finish this. She thought of every time someone had told her she wasn't enough, wasn't strong enough, wasn't worthy. Her burned hand found the pry bar still clutched in her grip. She drove it upward with everything she had left, catching Deke under the ribs. He gasped, his grip loosening. She drove her forehead into his nose, heard the crunch of breaking cartilage. He staggered back. The freight was 20 yards away. 15. The whistle was a living thing, screaming its metallic rage. Serafina grabbed Deke's coat, using his own momentum against him, and spun, throwing him toward the edge of the trestle, just as the supporting timber cracked from water pressure. The structure tilted. Deke's feet slipped. His hands, scrabbled for purchase, caught the rail for one moment. Serafina could have saved him, could have grabbed his wrist, pulled him back. Their eyes met, and in that instant, she saw him understand that his life was in her hands. She stepped back. Deke fell into the churning water below, just as the flood hit full force. The current took him, slammed him into rocks, with bone-breaking force, pulled him under. He surfaced once, gasping, then went down. He didn't surface again. The freight screamed past, so close, Serafina felt the wind of its passage, and then it was gone, vanishing into the night, and she was on her knees on the shaking trestle. Gulping air, her throat bruised, and burning her hands, shaking so hard she couldn't make them stop. Banner climbed up beside her, bleeding from a dozen cuts, his face pale but his eyes clear for the first time in 7 years. "You did it," he said. "It's over." Below them, the water tore through the partially constructed flume. Concrete shattered. The natural channel opened, and the limestone seeps began to weep tiny pearls of water, beading along the rock face exactly where the cipher had predicted. On the gorge rim, Tom Kitteridge saw his patron dead, saw the tide turn, and bolted for his horse. Mason Vale limped away, without a backward glance. Sheriff Crowley dropped his pistol, his face the color of old paper. And the townspeople of Ghost Hollow, farmers and shopkeepers, women and children, people who'd been neighbors and strangers and everything in between, stood witness to the moment their town chose survival over greed, community over profit, hope over despair. Serafina stumbled down from the trestle, her legs barely holding her. She ran to where Maddo lay, dropping to her knees beside him. His breathing was shallow, wet blood at the corners of his mouth. His eyes found hers. "Still breathing?" he whispered. "Still breathing." She confirmed, her voice breaking. She pressed her hands to his chest, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to do something, anything. "Hold on. Please, we're partners. Remember, partners." Dr. Hart was already there, bag open, pulling out instruments. "Get him flat, carefully." He worked with steady hands, probing the wound, assessing the damage. Punctured lung, broken ribs. I need to drain the blood from his chest before he drowns in it. Hart worked through the night. By dawn, Maddo was stable, unconscious, but alive, his chest rising and falling with shallow, careful breaths. Serafina refused to leave his side, holding his hand, watching every breath. Maddo woke 3 days later, his face pale and drawn. Serafina was there as she had been every moment, and when his eyes opened and found hers, relief flooded through her so profound it was almost painful. "You're still here," he whispered. "Where else would I be?" She squeezed his hand gently. "Partners, remember? Partners." He agreed, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. The aftermath unfolded with surprising speed. A federal marshal arrived within the week, drawn by telegrams Mrs. Bennett had sent to territorial authorities. Banner made a full confession to everything: the bribes, the corruption, and the secret he'd been carrying for 7 years. His testimony, combined with the documents Serafina had stolen and the physical evidence of the aquifer markers, was more than enough to convict Crowley and dismantle what remained of Deke's organization. Tom Kitteridge was caught trying to cross into Mexico and brought back to face trial. He was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Banner's fate was more complex. The federal marshal took his confession about the Cheyenne boy seriously, and Banner was prepared to face whatever justice demanded. But something unexpected happened. A delegation of Cheyenne elders came to Ghost Hollow, summoned by Mrs. Bennett, who'd taken it upon herself to tell the whole truth. The elders listened to Banner's confession, listened to his testimony about how Deke had used that guilt to force him into corruption, listened to how he'd finally chosen to do the right thing, even knowing it would cost him everything. After 3 days of deliberation, the eldest among them spoke. "You cannot bring back the boy you killed. That debt can never be repaid. But you have chosen to honor his memory by refusing to let more innocent blood be spilled. We sentence you to live to carry that weight and use it to prevent more death. That is harder than dying." Banner wept openly, and no one looked away. He was stripped of his badge, assigned to community service with the Water Committee, and required to make annual restitution to the boy's family for the rest of his life. It wasn't justice, not really, nothing could be, but it was mercy tempered with accountability, and Banner accepted it with humility that looked like genuine transformation. 3 months later, Ghost Hollow had begun to transform. The aquifer flowed freely, wells pumped steadily, gardens thrived. The town established a mutual water association with representation from homesteaders, Lakota elders, and merchants. Mrs. Bennett drafted the bylaws with her characteristic precision. Serafina's clinic flourished. She trained apprentices in botanical medicine, passing on her father's knowledge. Dr. Hart officially retired, though he still came by most days to offer advice and drink terrible coffee. Maddo healed slowly, his body mending in increments. He taught classes about water management and land stewardship, negotiated agreements between homesteaders and Lakota bands. The work mattered, and he did it with patient determination. On a warm spring evening, Maddo and Serafina stood before Mrs. Bennett and a gathering of townspeople and Lakota elders. They exchanged vows, written together promises about partnership and respect, about building something that honored both their fathers and the land they'd fought to save. Dr. Hart served as witness. A Lakota elder named Red Elk Mado's grandfather offered a blessing that spoke of water and earth and sacred stewardship. Mrs. Bennett pronounced them married under territorial law. The celebration was simple food, shared songs, sung stories told. As the sun set, Maddo and Serafina slipped away to the shelter by the spring, to the life they'd built together. That night, Maddo turned to Serafina with a look of such tenderness it stole her breath. He placed one hand gently against her cheek thumb, resting just below her eye, the gesture from that first night on the platform when everything had begun. "They said you didn't fit," he murmured. "I didn't," she agreed, leaning into his touch. "I still don't, not really." "Good," Maddo said, and she heard the smile in his voice. "Don't fit anywhere else. Just fit here. With me. Always," she promised. They came together that night with the slow, deliberate intimacy of two people who'd earned the right to this closeness through shared survival. Afterward, they lay tangled together under donated quilts, listening to the spring's quiet song outside their window. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Stepping in at the station, choosing to fight beside me?" "No." His answer came without hesitation. "Every choice led here. To this. To you. Even the pain. Especially the pain. Pain means we were alive enough to feel it. That we cared enough to fight for something worth having." Epilogue. 10 years later. The spring morning was clear and bright, the kind of day that made the prairie glow gold in the early light. Serafina Delphine Wicasa stood by the spring that bore both their fathers' names, watching her daughter teach her younger siblings to identify birds by their calls. Emni was 10 now, tall for her age, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn determination. She spoke 3 languages fluently and could identify every plant in the greenhouse by both botanical and traditional names. 2 more children had followed, a son named Etienne Red Elk and a daughter named Lark for Mrs. Bennett. Maddo emerged from their house, no longer a shelter, but a proper home built with help from the community, and came to stand beside her. His hand found hers automatically, their fingers interlacing with the ease of long practice. "Tell us the story," Emni called as she did most evenings. "About the train and the map and how you saved Ghost Hollow." Serafina and Maddo exchanged a glance. They'd told this story hundreds of times, but it never got old. They took turns describing the buffalo horn flask and the green vial, the theft of the ledgers, the confrontation at the gorge, the moment when the town had to choose between profit and survival. "And Deputy Banner?" Emini asked. "He really changed." "He did," Maddo confirmed. People can change, especially when they're forced to confront what their choices have cost. Banner chose redemption. Some people never forgave him, but he did the work. As full dark settled and the children wandered back to the house, Serafina and Maddo stayed by the spring, as they often did. "Do you ever think about that night at the station?" Serafina asked quietly. "What would have happened if you'd walked past me?" "Every day," Maddo admitted. "But not with regret, with gratitude. That moment, choosing to step in, it changed everything. Gave me purpose, gave me you, gave me all of this." "I think about the woman I would have been if I'd given up," Serafina said. "If I'd believed the letter accepted that I was unfit, I would have survived, probably. But I wouldn't have lived. There's a difference. They sat in comfortable silence. The spring burbled its quiet song. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. This was what their fathers had dreamed of when they'd created their map. Not just survival, but flourishing. Not just water, but life. Not just tolerance, but genuine partnership. Mato turned to Serafina, his hand finding her cheek in the gesture that had become theirs. They said you didn't fit. I didn't, she agreed. I still don't, not really. Too French for the Americans, too American for the French, too unconventional for polite society. Good, Mato said. Don't fit anywhere else. Just fit here. With me. With our children. With this life we built together. Always, she promised. They headed back to the house where their children slept and tomorrow's work waited. But before they went inside, Serafina paused at the threshold, looking back at the spring that bore their father's names, at the prairie that had nearly killed them and had ultimately saved them. Thank you, she whispered to the darkness. For the map, for the water, for all of it. The wind rose, carrying the scent of growing things, and she chose to believe it was an answer. Then she stepped inside into warmth and light, and the future they'd earned, and closed the door behind her. The spring kept singing. The water kept flowing. And in Ghost Hollow, proof remained that even in the hardest country, hope could take root and grow.